The night was heavy with rain. Outside, the streets of Ashworth village lay glistening under the dim glow of lanterns. But inside Lady Ashworth's old bookshop, a darker scene had unfolded. The air smelled of wax and damp paper. Candles flickered restlessly on tall shelves, casting long, trembling shadows across rows of forgotten books. And there, on the wooden floor, Edward Ashworth lay motionless. His once elegant face had turned pale and still, as if the life had been drained away by the very shadows around him. Beside his body, a leather-bound volume had been ripped apart, its pages torn like silent witnesses. Drops of wax fell slowly from a guttering candle, landing one by one into the pool of blood that spread wider with each second. It was no accident. It was murder. And before long, Miss Marple would find herself drawn into this chilling puzzle, where every book, every whisper, every flicker of candlelight might be hiding the truth. That morning, the sky above Ashworth village was crystal clear. A light breeze carried the faint scent of roses from the gardens around Gossington Hall. The old carriage house, once a crumbling stable, now gleamed with new whitewash and a polished oak sign that read in gold letters, "Lady Ashworth's Old Bookshop." The church bell tolled faintly in the distance, mingling with the chatter of sparrows. The whole village seemed to hum with excitement, as if awaiting a small festival. Inside, sunlight poured through tall windows, catching on rows of oak shelves freshly built for the occasion. Dozens of leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked with age, filled the air with the rich scent of old paper and beeswax polish. Lady Ashworth, dressed in a gray tweed dress, stood proudly by the doorway as villagers filed in. "We have given this old place new life," she declared warmly, "and every shilling we raise will go toward repairing the church roof. I hope this shop becomes more than shelves of books. It should be a place of stories, of memory, of community." Sir Thomas Ashworth, stout with a bristling mustache, lingered a step behind. He rapped his knuckles against one of the oak cases and murmured to an old friend, "Solid as a fortress. That carpenter's work will outlast us all." The crowd murmured its approval. Laughter rippled through the air, mingled with the rustle of pages being opened and admired. In a quiet corner, Miss Marple sat on a wooden chair, a small teacup resting on her lap. Her eyes, clear and sharp beneath the brim of her modest hat, took in every detail. She looked less like a guest enjoying a celebration and more like a watchful observer, reading the room as carefully as a book. "Jane, there," Lady Ashworth bustled over, clasping her friend's hand. "I must introduce you to the little team of volunteers who made this day possible." Miss Marple smiled gently and rose to greet them. The new faces. The first was Hugo Bellamy, a London gentleman whose silver-threaded hair and well-cut suit suggested both taste and wealth. He shook Miss Marple's hand smoothly, his smile just a little too polished. "A pleasure, madam. I only meant to lend a small hand, but one stumbles upon treasures in the most unlikely of places." Marple's eyes drifted to his hands. Long, careful fingers, trained in the handling of delicate things. But when his gaze fell on the glass case that displayed a rare Tennyson, In Memoriam, his expression shifted. For a fleeting moment, admiration gave way to something more calculating. Next was Clarissa Wood, the village librarian, thin and nervous, with round spectacles always slipping down her nose. She hugged a notebook filled with neat rows of catalog numbers and scribbled titles. "I only want the books arranged properly," she said softly, "so that anyone can find what they need." Lady Ashworth. The first signs of deception. The golden light of afternoon streamed through the tall windows of Lady Ashworth's bookshop. Sunbeams caught the drifting dust, turning each speck into a fleeting spark, while visitors moved leisurely between the oak shelves. The air smelled of beeswax polish, paper, and faintly of the morning's tea and shortbread. The charity opening had gone well, and Lady Ashworth's bright voice still echoed in memory, full of satisfaction. On the surface, the scene was peaceful, even idyllic. But for those with a careful eye, such as Miss Marple, there were threads of tension woven quietly beneath the calm. She remained seated near the corner table, knitting bag at her side, appearing like a harmless elderly lady enjoying an afternoon browse. Yet her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. Near the poetry alcove stood Sir Hugo Drake, the visiting rare book dealer from London. Tall, with silver at his temples and a smile polished to perfection, he had charmed most of the villagers that morning. But Miss Marple had noticed how his charm seemed to slip whenever he was left alone. Now, as the crowd thinned, his mask began to falter. He reached for a slim leather-bound volume, Tennyson's In Memoriam, labeled as a first edition. The book had drawn much admiration earlier, whispered about as one of the auction's star items. Drake opened it casually, but Miss Marple, glancing sideways, saw his face alter. The faint lines of confidence smoothed away into something sharper, a tension, almost alarm. His hand lingered too long on the binding, tracing the gold letters as though measuring them. For several moments he turned the pages with increasing agitation, aisles with brisk energy, her tweed jacket brushing against the shelves as she checked that everything remained in order. She was flushed with excitement still, proud of what had been achieved in just a few short weeks. At the desk, Clarissa Oswald looked up shyly as Lady Ashworth approached. "You've been such a blessing, Miss Oswald," Lady Ashworth said warmly. "Every card written so neatly, every book recorded. I don't know how we'd manage without you." Clarissa adjusted her spectacles, murmuring, "It's really nothing, my lady. Only some of these books haven't been properly catalogued for decades. There are references I've never seen before." Her words carried the quiet pride of a scholar who lived more with books than with people. Yet Miss Marple, watching from her corner, noticed the nervous twitch of her hands. Clarissa seemed anxious, as if something weighed heavily on her mind. Meanwhile, Basil Trent, the historian, hovered near a small oak table where a leather-bound pamphlet lay open. His pale eyes glowed with intensity as he bent over the faded pages. He spoke almost to himself, but loud enough for Lady Ashworth to hear. "These documents, references to the Kentish uprisings of 1630, remarkable. If only I could cross-reference them with the lost pamphlets I've read about. They may change our understanding entirely." "Always chasing rebellions, Basil," Lady Ashworth said with good humor. "Well, perhaps our little shop will help you turn up something unexpected." Trent nodded absent-mindedly, already lost again in the fragile paper. His air of distracted passion might have seemed harmless, but Miss Marple caught the way his hands shook slightly as he turned the page. Passion could drive men to curious lengths.
Across the room, Adelaide Pettigrew, the spinster collector, was nearly trembling with delight as she examined a Morocco-bound first edition. "The texture of the leather," she whispered reverentially. "The crispness of the paper edges. This is no ordinary volume." She looked up with bird-bright eyes. "I dare say this one might fetch hundreds of pounds if placed in the right hands." Lady Ashworth beamed at the enthusiasm of her little team. To her, the shop was a charitable venture, a way to save the church roof and offer joy to villagers. But to others, the dealer, the librarian, the historian, the collector, books meant more than charity. They meant power, status, even temptation. The afternoon drifted on. Customers came and went, coins clinking in the donation jar, polite chatter filling the air. Yet Miss Marple felt something unspoken curling beneath the surface. It was in Hugo Drake's restless fingers tapping against his thigh whenever he thought no one was looking. It was in Clarissa Oswald's furtive glances toward the catalogue desk. It was in Basil Trent's fevered eyes, and in the way Adelaide Pettigrew clutched each volume as if afraid someone might snatch it away, creating a sense of authority and allure. The mellow afternoon light slanted through the mullioned windows of the old carriage house, scattering geometric shadows across the polished wooden floor. The hum of conversation had softened. Many of the morning visitors had left, leaving behind the core group of volunteers and a handful of stragglers browsing the shelves. It was then that Hugo Drake's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "Lady Ashworth," he called, tone more urgent than polite, "may I have a private word?" Lady Ashworth turned, her brows lifting. "Of course, Mr. Drake." The dealer drew from the inside of his jacket a leather-bound volume. Even before he spoke, Miss Marple recognized the deep green Morocco binding, the Tennyson first edition she had seen him pocket earlier. "There's something troubling," Drake said, his usual polished manner cracking at the edges. He set the book down upon the oak desk with exaggerated care. "At first glance it appears genuine, but upon closer examination, well, I must admit, I have doubts." The words hung in the air like smoke. Lady Ashworth's expression hardened with concern. "Doubts? In what way?" Drake's hand traced the spine with almost theatrical precision. "The leather is fine enough, but the tooling, see here, the gilt is too fresh, almost gleaming as if pressed yesterday. And the paper, yes, it's good quality, but it lacks the subtle imperfections that any mid-19th century printing should bear." Miss Oswald, hovering nervously nearby, blurted out, "Perhaps it was rebound, sir. Many collectors restore their treasures." "Rebound, yes," Drake allowed, though his tone was dismissive. "But typography, ink, paper fibers, these are not so easily explained. No, I fear this may be something else entirely, a counterfeit concealed within the donations." Lady Ashworth's cheeks flushed. "Impossible. The book was gifted by Mrs. Weatherby, whose late husband was a noted collector. His library was impeccable." "With respect, Lady Ashworth," Drake said smoothly, "provenance is not always authenticity. Even the most reputable collections can be deceived. That is why I strongly recommend that this volume be removed from display and sent to London at once. With my equipment, I could determine the truth." His eyes glinted with hunger as he spoke, though he tried to mask it with professional authority. Miss Marple, observing from her chair, noticed how tightly his fingers gripped the desk edge.
Chapter 3: A Death in the Bookshop. The evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with a hush that felt almost deliberate. As if the village itself were holding its breath. The cheerful bustle of the bookshop's opening day was gone. The courtyard was empty. The lights in Lady Ashworth's house already glowing warmly across the green. Lady Ashworth herself locked the heavy oak door of the converted carriage house with a flourish, humming faintly as she turned the key. A remarkable success, she murmured, tightening her scarf against the chill. Far more than I hoped for. She started across the cobblestones toward the main house, her thoughts already drifting to dinner, when a sound stopped her in her tracks. It was faint at first, a dull thud, followed by a scraping noise. Then, unmistakably, a cry, not a cheerful shout, not the chatter of late passers-by, but something raw and distressed. Lady Ashworth froze, her handbag clutched to her side. The sound had come from the bookshop. Yet she had locked the door herself not a minute earlier. The courtyard was deserted, the autumn air cold enough that even the night birds seemed subdued. She hesitated only briefly before rushing back. Fumbling with the keys, she forced the lock open. The door creaked as she pushed it wide, releasing a breath of air heavy with paper, polish, and something else, something sharp and metallic. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The bookshop was dim, lit only by the fading twilight filtering through the tall windows. At first, all seemed still, then her eyes adjusted, and she saw it, the far corner. The poetry alcove. A bookcase had toppled, its heavy oak frame leaning at an angle, shelves spilling their contents across the floor in a chaotic scatter of leather and parchment. And beneath it, half-pinned, lay a man. "Hugo Drake," she gasped. Rushing forward, the book dealer's fine suit was rumpled, his dark hair askew, his face ashen, his eyes were closed, his chest frighteningly still. "Mr. Drake, can you hear me?" she cried. Kneeling beside him, she pushed at the bookcase with all her strength. But it barely shifted. The thing was solid oak, built to endure decades, and laden with weighty tomes. Alone, she was powerless. Her panic sharpened into action. She dashed back across the courtyard, skirts swishing, and into the main hall of Ashworth Manor. "Arthur," she shouted, her voice echoing through the paneled rooms. "Arthur, quickly, come." The bookshop. Colonel Ashworth, dignified even in his retirement slippers, looked up from his evening paper in bewilderment. "What the devil is it, my dear?" "There's been an accident. Hugo Drake. He's trapped. Come at once." Within minutes, the colonel, two groundsmen, and a neighbor who had heard the commotion were in the bookshop, their combined strength heaving at the toppled shelf. The groan of wood filled the room as the case was lifted enough for Lady Ashworth to pull Drake's limp form free. "Careful, Dr. Haydock," the village physician summoned in haste, knelt immediately at Drake's side. His practiced hands moved over the man's body, checking pulse, breathing, eyes. The room held its breath. At last, Haydock sat back on his heels, his face grim. "I'm afraid there is nothing to be done." Lady Ashworth staggered backward, her hand clutching at her throat. No, it must be a mistake, surely." "I am sorry," Haydock said softly. "The injuries are severe. The fall of the bookcase alone might have done it. But there is something else." His hand brushed Drake's temple, where blood had matted the dark hair. "A sharp trauma here, localized. This wound was dealt before the bookcase fell." A chill descended over the room. The volunteers, summoned in haste from nearby cottages, clustered in the doorway, Miss Oswald pale and trembling, Basil Trent with eyes wide in disbelief, Adelaide Pettigrew clutching her handbag like a shield. "You mean," Colonel Ashworth said slowly, his voice stiff with military gravity, "this was no accident?" "I fear not," Haydock replied, his words hung in the candlelit air, heavy as the silence that followed. Lady Ashworth swayed, gripping the edge of a table for support. The cheerful, bustling bookshop that had seemed so full of promise hours earlier now felt transformed into something entirely different, a chamber of secrets, of danger. And in that moment, Miss Marple, who had quietly arrived after hearing the commotion from the green, stepped into the shop. Her eyes, calm yet piercing, moved from the fallen shelf to the lifeless body, then to the anxious faces gathered around. She said nothing at first, but those who knew her well, like Lady Ashworth, recognized the look in her eyes. Miss Marple was already observing, already noting the smallest details. A missing ladder pushed aside, A scatter of books inconsistent with a simple fall. The faintest trace of white powder on Drake's cuff. The silence stretched, and the candlelight flickered, throwing restless shadows across the walls. Miss Marple spoke at last, her voice quiet, almost conversational. "I do not think we are standing in the scene of an accident." Her words, so mild in tone, fell like a verdict upon the room. The words left Miss Marple's lips so softly that, for a heartbeat, no one reacted. The volunteers and neighbors seemed suspended between disbelief and dawning fear. Then Adelaide Pettigrew broke the silence with a thin cry. Not an accident? But then, she pressed a hand to her mouth, her sharp eyes darting nervously toward the fallen shelves as though the truth might leap out from the jumble of books. Inspector Graves, who had been summoned from the village constabulary, arrived at that very moment, his heavy boots echoing on the oak floor. A brisk man with a skeptical manner. He listened as Dr. Haydock repeated his conclusion about the wound on Hugo Drake's temple. Graves frowned, rubbing his chin. So he was struck first, and then the bookcase brought down on him to make it look like an accident. His gaze swept the room. Deliberate staging, which means one of you was here with him after closing time. The atmosphere thickened, a dozen denials clamored at once. Miss Oswald's timid whisper of, "I had already gone home." Basil Trent's grave insistence that he had been at his cottage preparing notes. Adelaide Pettigrew's indignant cry that she would never be caught alone with a man after dark. Lady Ashworth raised her chin. "I locked the door myself. If anyone remained inside, it must have been with a key or through another way in." At this, Miss Marple stirred. She stepped delicately through the mess of books on the floor. Her eyes lowered, examining without appearing to. "There is always another way in. Lady Ashworth, locks are not always the protection we imagine them to be." Her gaze shifted toward the small window at the back, slightly ajar despite the chill outside. The inspector followed her eyes and cursed under his breath. "Williams," he barked to the young constable, "mark that window. Dust it tomorrow." But Miss Marple was not yet finished. She crouched, surprisingly nimble for her age, and picked up a book that had landed spine up near Drake's outstretched hand. It was a volume of Tennyson's poems, its morocco binding scuffed, its gilt letters gleaming unnaturally bright in the flickering candlelight. She turned the book slowly, her fingers tracing the cover. "Curious," she murmured. "This is one of the books Mr. Drake had shown particular interest in earlier today." Her eyes, sharp as needles, darted to Basil Trent. "You were there, Mr. Trent. Did you not see him pocket it, only to replace it later?" Trent's pale face flushed. I noticed nothing of the sort. I was in the history section. My work, you understand, does not concern poetry." Miss Marple gave no reply, only closed the book with a faint snap and handed it to Inspector Graves. The inspector held it up. Why would a man risk staying after hours for this, unless there was something more valuable about it than its cover suggests? The tension in the room climbed, each volunteer watching the others with unease. Clarissa Oswald wrung her hands, the ink still staining her fingertips. Perhaps Mr. Drake, perhaps he slipped. He could have been alone, trying to move the shelf. Impossible, Dr. Haydock interrupted firmly. The blow to his temple was struck with precision. "That is no accident." Miss Marple's voice floated gently above the argument. "And there is the matter of the ladder. I see it has fallen, yet none of the upper shelves are disturbed. Why would he fetch a ladder, if not forced into some scuffle that knocked it down?" All eyes turned to the ladder, lying awkwardly against the floorboards. It seemed, suddenly, like a silent witness. Inspector Graves straightened. "Right, no one leaves this building. Statements will be taken at once." The volunteers exchanged glances, fearful, defensive, some indignant. Outside, rain began to patter against the windows, as if the very sky sought to press its weight upon the gathering. In the quiet that followed, Miss Marple folded her hands calmly, but her blue eyes glimmered with certainty. Already, she had begun to unravel the threads, the forged gilding, the dustless shelf, the oddly bright volume of Tennyson. The tragedy in the bookshop was no simple accident of falling wood and paper. It was murder, wrapped carefully in the guise of mishap. And Miss Marple, in her quiet way, was already watching for the next loose thread that would reveal the hand that had woven the lie. Inspector Graves wasted no time. He stationed Constable Williams by the entrance, then turned back to the uneasy circle of volunteers and neighbors. His tone was brisk, the authority in it undeniable. "Each of you will give an account of your movements this evening. But let me be perfectly clear, Mr. Drake did not die by mischance. He was struck, and someone here knows more than they've admitted. A murmur rippled through the group. Clarissa Oswald sat very straight, her spectacles glinting. I told you. I came back only for my spectacles. I found them on the desk. Nothing more. Miss Marple's knitting bag hung lightly on her wrist. She did not sit, but wandered softly, peering at shelves and scattered volumes as though she were simply admiring patterns. Yet every word spoken reached her. Inspector Graves continued, Mr. Trent? Basil Trent cleared his throat. His scholar's composure was visibly shaken. I was at home, in my study, revising notes. The storm had already begun by then. I did not return here after closing. Miss Marple turned, her blue eyes resting on him just long enough to make him falter. Then she bent to pick up a torn scrap of card from the floor. Interesting, she said mildly. She handed it to Graves. The inspector read aloud. Lot 27 Tennyson. Reserve £300. The crowd stirred again. Adelaide Pettigrew gasped. £300? That can't be right. Lady Ashworth, hadn't you told me the reserve was far lower? Lady Ashworth's face stiffened. Indeed I had. £30, not 300. The silence that followed was heavy. Then Miss Marple, still gentle, remarked, a knot can change everything, especially when written by the wrong hand. All eyes flicked to Basil Trent. He bristled, his pale cheeks mottled with color. Are you suggesting I altered the ledger? Absurd, I only wished to see the pamphlets for my research. Graves cut him short. We'll examine the records in full. Until then, Mr. Trent, you remain under suspicion. Clarissa Oswald clutched her handbag tightly. Inspector, must we all be suspected? Perhaps Mr. Drake himself forged the entry. He was, after all, a dealer. But Miss Marple's voice came like a whisper of steel. A dealer, yes, yet look, his hands still bear the dust of binding paste. Not ink, she gestured toward Drake's lifeless fingers, faintly smeared with a chalky residue. Someone else wrote in that ledger. Inspector Graves straightened, excitement sharpening his voice. You saw that, Miss Marple? I see only what is there. She replied serenely. The dust tells its tale. Mr. Drake was not writing, but handling bindings. That leaves others to explain the ink. The circle tightened, the storm outside lashed against the windows, and thunder growled overhead. Adelaide Pettigrew's sharp features twitched as though she were about to speak. Then thought better of it. Basil Trent's fists clenched, Clarissa's lips pressed into a thin line. At last, Lady Ashworth broke the silence. Whoever has done this, you have stained what was meant to be a gift for the parish. For the roof fund, you've destroyed more than a man tonight. You've cast a shadow over our whole endeavor. Her words hung in the air like a judgment. Inspector Graves snapped his notebook shut. Enough for now. This shop is sealed as a crime scene. None of you may leave the village without reporting to me. I'll have each of you interviewed separately. The group dispersed slowly, whispering among themselves, glancing sidelong at one another with suspicion. Constable Williams closed the door behind them, leaving only Graves, Dr. Haydock, and Miss Marple within. Graves turned to the elderly lady. You've seen something more, haven't you? Miss Marple smiled faintly, the expression that always meant she knew more than she said. Only threads, Inspector, but threads can make a tapestry. The book that gleams too brightly. A ladder fallen with no cause. A scrap of violet ink out of place. Threads, yes, and in time, they will show us the hand that wove this fabric of lies. Outside, the rain hammered harder, as if the night itself conspired to keep its secrets. But within the quiet shadows of Bantry's, no, Ashworth's, old bookshop, one truth had already taken root. Hugo Drake had not died by accident. He had been murdered. Chapter 4. The morning after. The scene revisited. Morning sunlight broke reluctantly through the thinning clouds, casting pale beams across the village of St. Mary Mead. The storm had passed, but its traces lingered, muddy paths, damp hedgerows, and a strange hush that seemed to hang over the cottages. The news of Hugo Drake's death had already traveled fast. Farmers, tradesmen, even children running errands spoke of nothing else. The bookshop murder. Inspector Graves arrived early, his boots heavy with mud as he stepped into the courtyard of Lady Ashworth's converted carriage house. Constable Williams stood guard at the door, cap pulled low, his youthful face still pale from the previous night's discovery. Inside, the shop was exactly as they had left it, shelves looming in neat rows. Except for the poetry alcove where chaos reigned, books lay scattered across the floor, the great oak bookcase still tilted at an unnatural angle even after being righted. The chalk outlines marked where Drake's body had lain. Dust motes floated in the morning light like silent witnesses. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes later, dressed plainly but with her usual air of quiet precision. She paused in the doorway, eyes narrowing slightly as she surveyed the scene. To most, the chaos of the fallen bookcase was all there was to see. To her, every shifted shadow, every overturned volume, every irregular streak of dust hinted at a story waiting to be told. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Inspector Graves greeted, though his voice carried more weariness than warmth. He respected her, but this was official police work, and yet, he had learned better than to ignore her observations. "Such a dreadful business," she said softly, adjusting her gloves, "and yet the room still speaks. Inspector, one only needs to listen carefully." Graves sighed. "Then let us listen together." They began with the floor. The inspector bent to study the marks left by the fallen bookcase. Deep scratches scored the wooden boards, but oddly, only beneath one corner. The other side had landed far more gently, as though eased down by deliberate hands. Miss Marple crouched beside him, surprisingly nimble for her age. "See here," she murmured, pointing to a faint arc of disturbed dust. "If the bookcase had fallen naturally, all shelves would have spilled outward. But notice, this shelf has hardly lost a single volume." Graves frowned. "So the collapse was staged? Or guided?" She replied gently. "Someone wished it to appear an accident." They moved next to the ladder, found lying on its side the night before. Inspector Graves lifted it for closer inspection. "Sticky residue here," he muttered, rubbing his fingers together. Haydock mentioned something like binding paste. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Binding paste, the same as on poor Mr. Drake's hands. Curious, isn't it, that a book dealer should die with traces of fresh glue on his fingers, when no repairs were being done in this shop?" Graves jotted a note in his book. "We'll trace the source, perhaps from a local binder." Finally, their attention turned to the ledger on the catalog desk. The page for Lot 27 still lay open, the bold figure of £300 glaring from the otherwise neat script. The difference in ink color was obvious in daylight, violet against black. "Sloppy forgery," Graves muttered. "Not sloppy," Miss Marple corrected, her tone mild. "Calculated. Whoever wrote that knew the catalog would be seen by few, and the auction would draw only those interested in rare editions. A single zero can make a fortune vanish, or appear." The inspector closed the ledger with a snap. "We'll confront them all this morning. Lady Ashworth, Miss Oswald, Mr. Trent, Miss Pettigrew. I want each of their stories in sequence. Someone will contradict themselves." Miss Marple smiled faintly, as if she already knew the outcome. "Ah yes, Inspector, truth is rather like dust. It settles evenly, until someone tries to sweep it away. Then the pattern reveals more than they intend." Together, they stepped out of the bookshop. The sun had broken fully through now, glinting on the puddles in the courtyard. Villagers lingered nearby, whispering and casting anxious glances. For them, the bookshop had been a proud venture, a beacon of community spirit. Now it was a place of shadows and suspicion. Inspector Graves squared his shoulders. "Let's begin." Testimonies and contradictions. The villagers had gathered in Lady Ashworth's drawing room, its polished oak panels and lace-draped windows offering a deceptive air of comfort. But the atmosphere was anything but calm. 4 people sat in a row like schoolchildren waiting for examination. Lady Ashworth herself, dignified yet visibly shaken; Clarissa Oswald, the village librarian, fidgeting with her spectacles; Basil Trent, the historian, stiff and pale; and Ada Pettigrew, the eccentric collector of first editions, her sharp eyes darting nervously. Inspector Graves stood before them, notebook ready. Miss Marple took a quiet seat by the window, knitting bag at her side, though her needles remained still. Her eyes watched every twitch, every hesitation, every nervous glance. "Let us begin," Graves said briskly. "Each of you will recount your movements yesterday evening. Be precise, omit nothing." Lady Ashworth spoke first, her voice steady but tinged with indignation. "I locked the bookshop myself. Just after 6, everyone had left, or so I believed. My husband was in the library, and I went to prepare for supper. I heard nothing more until the dreadful commotion later." Miss Marple tilted her head, noting the way Lady Ashworth's hands clenched in her lap. She was telling the truth, but perhaps not the whole truth. Next came Clarissa Oswald. The librarian's voice quavered as she confessed. I returned after hours. I had forgotten my spectacles. I saw that a window was left slightly ajar, so I let myself in. It was foolish, I know, but I only meant to retrieve my things. Did you see Mr. Drake? Graves pressed. Clarissa hesitated, fingers twisting together. I heard voices. One of them was his. He seemed agitated, as though quarreling with someone. But when I entered, he was already pinned beneath the bookcase. Her eyes brimmed with tears. I tried to help. Truly I did. Graves scribbled notes, his eyes narrowing. You claim you heard 2 voices. Whose was the other? I cannot say for certain. She whispered. It was muffled. The inspector grunted, unconvinced. Miss Marple, however, noticed the faint flush on Clarissa's cheeks. She knew more than she dared admit. Then it was Basil Trent's turn. The historian rose slightly in his chair, his lean frame rigid with pride. I left promptly after the ribbon cutting. I dined alone at my cottage, where I remained until Constable Williams fetched me later. My interests are scholarly, Inspector, not criminal, yet you spent much of the day poring over the poetry shelves. Miss Marple interjected gently, her voice mild, specifically, the section containing the Tennyson volume. Trent's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before he forced a thin smile. Purely academic curiosity. Madam, I study the 17th century. Tennyson holds little for me beyond literary charm. But Miss Marple noted the contradiction. His gaze had betrayed a sharper interest. Finally came Ada Pettigrew. The small spinster clutched her handbag as though it contained her very soul. I left when Lady Ashworth closed the shop. I returned home directly. Books are my love, Inspector, but not murder. Did you notice anything unusual during the day? Graves asked. Ada's eyes darted toward Clarissa, then quickly away, only that Mr. Drake seemed restless. He examined certain volumes with more eagerness than was proper. I thought it odd. The silence that followed was heavy. Each testimony contained fragments of truth, yet none fit neatly together. Inspector Graves paced slowly before them. One of you knows more than you're saying. Mr. Drake did not die by accident. He was struck before the bookcase fell, and until we unravel who was with him, none of you are free from suspicion. Clarissa Oswald's breath hitched. Basil Trent stiffened. Lady Ashworth's composure cracked for a heartbeat. Ada Pettigrew pressed her lips together. By the window, Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap. Her eyes glittered with quiet certainty. The contradictions were like uneven stitches in a pattern. With patience, she knew, the entire design would reveal itself. The lies exposed. The silence in Lady Ashworth's drawing room grew heavy, thick with suspicion. Outside, the faint toll of the village church bell drifted through the windows, as though marking the passing moments of truth slipping away. Inspector Graves's pen scratched across the page. We have testimonies, he said firmly, but they do not align. And in my experience, when stories do not fit, it is because someone is lying. No one spoke. Basil Trent's jaw tightened. Clarissa Oswald looked down at her trembling hands. Ada Pettigrew's eyes flickered from one face to another, bird-like and wary. It was Miss Marple who broke the silence. Her voice calm, almost gentle. It is curious, is it not, Inspector, how details are remembered? They often reveal far more than intended. She leaned slightly forward, her knitting forgotten on her lap. Take, for example, Miss Oswald's claim that she heard voices before she entered the shop. If she truly believed Lady Ashworth had left, why did she not call out at once? Why creep in through a window instead of knocking at the locked door? Clarissa flushed crimson. I was embarrassed at forgetting my spectacles. She stammered, but embarrassment does not explain silence in the face of what sounded like a quarrel. Miss Marple continued, her tone deceptively mild. You feared being recognized, my dear. You knew the other voice. Clarissa's lips parted, but no words came. The inspector's eyes narrowed. Miss Marple turned to Basil Trent. And then there is Mr. Trent. He insists Tennyson is of no interest to him, and yet he was seen hovering about the poetry shelves all afternoon. Why, if not for that very volume? Curiosity alone cannot account for the agitation you displayed whenever anyone approached it. Trent's pale face stiffened, his scholarly dignity wavering. I was searching for references to the uprisings of 1630. He protested. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. In Tennyson, a poet of the Victorian age? That is rather like searching for a steam engine in Shakespeare. A ripple of uneasy laughter escaped Ada Pettigrew before she quickly smothered it. The inspector stepped closer. So which is it, Trent? Were you studying poetry or concealing your interest in the Tennyson first edition? Trent swallowed hard, but his lips pressed shut. And finally, Miss Marple said softly, turning to Ada Pettigrew, our collector of first editions. You claim to have gone home directly, yet your shoes bear a smear of beeswax, the very polish Lady Ashworth used on the bookshop's floors yesterday afternoon. Curious, is it not, that your path home should take you through freshly waxed oak? Ada gasped, clutching her handbag tighter. That proves nothing, she cried. Anyone could have. Ah, Miss Marple interrupted gently, but only you carried a candle stub of the same make as those in the shop. It was discovered in your satchel this morning, still warm with recent use. You were there, Miss Pettigrew, after the shop was closed. Ada's mouth opened and shut like a caught bird, but she said nothing. The drawing room crackled with tension. Inspector Graves's gaze swept the line of suspects, his voice low and measured. So, each of you has painted yourselves into a corner. Lies, half-truths, omissions, until one of you speaks plainly. You all remain under suspicion of Hugo Drake's death. Clarissa buried her face in her hands. Basil Trent's fists clenched on his knees. Ada Pettigrew stared at the floor. Lady Ashworth, white-faced, gripped the armrest of her chair. Only Miss Marple remained serene. She looked around the room, her eyes kind yet unyielding. The truth has a way of seeping out, Inspector, like ink through old parchment. It cannot be hidden forever. The inspector snapped his notebook shut. Enough for today. I will have statements written and signed. And know this, the lies you cling to will not shield you long. We will find the cracks. And when we do, they will shatter. As the suspects were dismissed, Miss Marple quietly gathered her knitting. To others, the morning had ended in frustration. But to her, the contradictions had spoken louder than confessions. She had seen fear in Clarissa's hesitation, desperation in Trent's denial, and guilt flickering in Ada's eyes. Each thread was flawed, but together they wove the outline of truth. The old lady stepped out into the pale morning sun, her mind sharper than ever. Somewhere among those broken testimonies lay the path to the killer. She only needed patience, and she had plenty of that. Chapter 5: The Forgery in the First Edition. Whispers in the village. The coroner's inquest had been set for the following Tuesday, and Inspector Graves had made it clear that until then, Lady Ashworth's bookshop would remain closed. The once cheerful carriage house, now sealed behind yellow tape, looked less like a place of learning and charity and more like a silent witness to a crime. St. Mary's Mead was buzzing. In the tea shop, at the post office, even along the hedgerows where neighbors met to chat, the same words were whispered again and again. Murder. Forgery. Betrayal. A man had been crushed beneath a bookcase. But no one in the village believed it was an accident any longer. Miss Marple, however, was not one to rely on whispers. On Friday afternoon, she sat in her rose-patterned armchair, her knitting needles clicking steadily, while her thoughts turned again and again to the peculiarities of the case. She remembered the gold flecks on Drake's cuff, the binding paste on his fingers, the torn catalog card with the altered reserve price. Each detail gnawed at her with the persistence of a loose thread in embroidery. It was then that she heard a hesitant knock at her door. Setting aside her work, she opened it to find Clarissa Oswald, the village librarian, standing there with a strained expression. Miss Marple, Clarissa began, wringing her hands. I hardly know where else to turn. Come in, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. A kettle is already on the boil. Once seated, Clarissa clutched her teacup so tightly that Miss Marple feared it might crack. Her voice was low and uncertain, but the urgency in her eyes betrayed the weight of what she carried. It's about the bookshop, she whispered, something I discovered before the tragedy. Miss Marple did not press her, but waited. Long experience had taught her that silence often loosens tongues more effectively than questions. I found 2 copies, Clarissa blurted out at last. 2 copies of the same book. Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. 2 copies? Yes, of the Tennyson in memoriam. Both bound in Morocco leather. Both stamped with gilt lettering. Both appearing to be first editions from 1850. At first I thought I had made a mistake in my notes. But when I checked the shelves, there they were, side by side. She paused, her breath catching. At a glance, they were identical, but one was too perfect. The binding flawless, the gold shining like new, the paper smooth, without the tiny flaws one expects in something printed a century ago. When I examined it under a glass, I even saw traces of modern glue in the spine. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened though her voice remained calm. So one was genuine, the other a forgery. Clarissa nodded miserably. Yes, and I was foolish. I didn't tell Lady Ashworth. I feared she'd think me careless. That I had confused the records. I told myself I would investigate further before raising alarm. But when I returned to the shop that evening, there was only one Tennyson left. The genuine one. The forgery had vanished. The room seemed to grow still around them. Outside, the distant cry of a cart driver echoed along the lane. But inside Miss Marple's cottage, time held its breath. Clarissa's eyes brimmed with tears. Do you see what this means? Someone removed the forged book before the murder. And I may be the only one who noticed it ever existed. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand over the younger woman's trembling fingers. On the contrary, my dear, it means you are the only one who can help reveal the truth. The forgery is at the heart of this affair. Whoever handled it, whether to create it, to sell it, or to hide it, holds the key to Hugo Drake's death. Clarissa's shoulders sagged, relief and dread mingling in her expression. She had unburdened herself, but the weight of her confession lingered, like the faint smell of smoke long after the fire is gone. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes narrowing as though she could already see the threads connecting. 2 Tennysons, one real, one false, and now one missing, a forgery that whispered of greed, deceit, and, perhaps, murder. The question was no longer who could kill, but rather who among them had the skill and the desperation to forge history itself. Secrets beneath the gilding. The following morning, Miss Marple walked the familiar lane that led from her cottage toward Gossington Hall. The bookshop was still sealed, its cheerful gold-lettered sign looking oddly mocking above the locked door. A constable stood guard, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Miss Marple did not pause, but continued up to the house. Lady Ashworth had agreed to receive her. Inside, the drawing-room carried the fragrance of roses mixed with the faint tang of beeswax polish. Lady Ashworth sat near the window, her usually bright face drawn with fatigue. "My dear Jane," she said with a weary sigh, "it is dreadful. The inspector has been most officious, questioning everyone, even suggesting improprieties about the catalogue." Miss Marple lowered herself delicately into an armchair. "It is his duty, Dolly. A man is dead, and forgery, you know, often walks hand in hand with violence." Lady Ashworth shuddered. "I cannot bear to think such wickedness has entered my little project." At that moment, Basil Trent, the historian, was shown into the room. His pale eyes gleamed with suppressed tension. "Forgive my intrusion, Lady Ashworth. I came to inquire whether Inspector Graves had found the pamphlet." Lady Ashworth frowned. "Pamphlet?" Trent shifted uncomfortably, but before he could reply, Miss Marple spoke in her mild, precise way. "Ah, yes, the 17th century tract you mentioned at the opening. But surely, Mr. Trent, your interest lies more with history than with poetry. Why such an anxious concern for a Tennyson volume?" For the briefest instant, Trent's lips tightened, and then he recovered. "Merely scholarly curiosity, Miss Marple. One never knows where rare material may be tucked away." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. "Indeed, and yet I cannot help but wonder why a historian's ink should be violet. It stands out, you know, particularly when altering a ledger." Trent stiffened. "Are you implying—" "Nothing at all," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Only that ink is often as revealing as handwriting. One should never underestimate such small details." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Then Lady Ashworth briskly changed the subject, asking about the coroner's inquest, and Trent excused himself with a stiff bow. When the door closed, Lady Ashworth turned to Miss Marple. Her cheeks flushed. "Jane, you don't really think Basil?" Miss Marple shook her head. "I think, dear Dolly, that too many people have too much interest in a single volume of Tennyson. That is enough to make me suspicious." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the village library. Clarissa Oswald greeted her nervously, spectacles perched crookedly on her nose. She seemed both relieved and fearful to see the old lady. "You told me yesterday of the 2 Tennysons," Miss Marple began softly, "but what you did not tell me is whether anyone else might have seen them." Clarissa hesitated. I believe Mr. Drake knew. He handled one of the volumes with a strange intensity. I saw him slip it into his jacket, claiming he wanted closer study. I thought, perhaps, he had taken the forgery." Miss Marple's knitting bag shifted slightly on her lap as she considered. "And did you challenge him?" Clarissa's face flushed. "No, I was afraid. He had such a commanding way. And he spoke of the book as though it were his by right. I told myself it was none of my business." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained firm. "My dear, In matters of books, and of people, it is always wise to notice what does not belong. Clarissa lowered her head, shame mingling with relief. Do you think the forgery is the reason he was killed? Miss Marple did not answer directly. She gazed out the window, where the afternoon light painted golden patterns across the shelves. Forgery, she said at last, is a dangerous trade. It is not only paper and ink that are counterfeited, but trust, reputation, even friendships, and when those collapse, people are sometimes crushed as surely as poor Mr. Drake beneath the bookcase. Clarissa shivered, and in that quiet library, with its smell of ink and dust, the truth felt closer than ever. Somewhere between genuine and false, between loyalty and betrayal, lay the motive for murder. And Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle manner, was determined to unravel it. The hand behind the too perfect book. Late in the afternoon, gray clouds closed over the cobbled road that led to Much Benham. Miss Marple, in her plain felt hat, walked slowly through the market square and turned into a narrow lane behind the church. At the far end hung a faded sign, Eldridge and Sons, bookbinders and restorers. The air inside carried the mixed scent of leather, glue, and old paper. A small bell jingled as she pushed the door open. Behind a workbench, Mr. Eldridge, a silver-haired bookbinder with glue on his fingers, looked up. Good day, madam. Good day, Mr. Eldridge, Miss Marple replied with her gentle smile. I need a little advice about some urgent work done on Victorian poetry. The man stiffened for a moment, then covered it with a professional smile. Well, if you bring the book. I did not bring it, she interrupted softly, but a gentleman did. Tennyson, in memoriam, Morocco binding, fresh gilt letters, requested to match it exactly to an original, and he insisted it be finished overnight. The binder's hands froze for a second. Tiny gold flakes clung to his nails. We only reinforce hinges here. Clean the gold. You used modern PVA glue, not animal glue, and replaced the end papers with a modern Oxford marble pattern. Miss Marple continued calmly. That paper ages too quickly when treated with low heat. A heavy silence. At last, he sighed. I did nothing illegal. The customer paid cash, wanted it for an exhibition. A smart man, stiff collar, London accent. His name was Gregory Vale. The name confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. She let her eyes sweep across the bench. A trimming knife with a new blade. A pot of gold leaf. A jar of PVA glue, and a wastebin filled with scraps. She bent, picked out a piece of marbled paper still warm from drying. On its edge, a faint brown streak. Tea stain. With gamboge, she murmured. Very clever aging. Eldridge flushed. I only did what I was paid to do. Miss Marple's tone softened. I am not here to accuse you, Mr. Eldridge. I only need the time and the method. So he told her. 3 nights ago Vale had brought in a loose-leaf Tennyson. Demanded perfect retooling of the spine. New end papers. Exact gilt letters. Paid extra for overnight work. He was obsessed. Eldridge admitted that no one must guess the book had been touched. Miss Marple thanked him, took a strip of marbled scrap, and left. That evening, in the reading room of Gossington Hall, Inspector Graves spread documents across the table. Lady Ashworth stood near him, clutching her lace handkerchief. Miss Marple laid down the scrap and Eldridge's work ticket. Gregory Vale replaced the end papers, redid the gilt, and used PVA glue. She explained, this was finished the very morning before the murder. That is why fresh gilt and glue were found on Drake's fingers. He had touched the renewed book. Graves tapped his pen. Vale swore he only handled the book during the opening, not afterward. Miss Marple gave a thin smile. He forgot about the dust. She tilted the scrap under the lamp. A small trace of oak shelf dust embedded in the glue. The same type of dust clung to Vale's glove, which I saw earlier today at his storehouse. She produced a small envelope with fine reddish powder, and on the cuff of that glove, tiny gold flakes identical to Eldridge's supply. Lady Ashworth whispered, but why did Drake die? Miss Marple opened another sheet. The altered auction record. £30 changed to £300 in violet ink. A double scheme. First, inflate the reserve price. Second, swap the real book for a false one, so the hidden contents inside the original could be removed without notice. Drake realized it, wanted to expose it, and died in what was made to look like an accident. Graves leaned forward. You believe there was something inside the real Tennyson? Not poetry, Miss Marple said quietly. A concealed document, like the pamphlet Basil Trent so desired. Vale did not care for the poems. He cared for what was hidden within. At dusk, Gregory Vale entered, polished as ever, a smile on his lips. "I hear you wish to clear up a misunderstanding," he said smoothly. Miss Marple set the marbled scrap beneath the lamp. "Collectors rarely replace endpapers without cause. Yet you paid Eldridge to do exactly that, overnight. In cash." Vale shrugged. "Helping a charity, a little restoration raises value. What's wrong with that?" "Wrong in the timing," Inspector Graves said sternly. "Morning. The book altered. Night. A man dead. Wrong in the purpose. You disguised. Not preserved. And wrong in the traces." Miss Marple held up a glass vial. "Gold leaf from your sleeve. Dust from the oak poetry shelf on your glove. And PVA glue smudged on the ladder inside the shop. The same glue Eldridge used. These are not coincidences, Mr. Vale." For the first time, the smile slipped. "You cannot prove I killed Drake." Vale whispered. "I agree," Miss Marple said softly. "I do not believe you struck the fatal blow. But you know who did, and what Drake had discovered. Something far more precious than a book." Vale's eyes darted toward the window. His voice dropped. "Drake had it on him that night. A letter, from the Civil War. He claimed, said it would change everything. He refused to share. I only made the stage prop. He kept the treasure." Inspector Graves's voice was iron. "Then we shall find it. And those who killed him." Miss Marple folded the marbled scrap as neatly as a thread into embroidery. "The web of lies begins with Vale," she said quietly, "but the final knot lies in the hidden compartment of the Atlas cabinet. That is where the truth waits." Chapter 6 Whispers Behind the Books. The uneasy morning. The morning after the shocking death. St. Mary Mead seemed unusually quiet. Mist hung low over the hedgerows. And even the sparrows on the church roof chirped more softly, as if aware of the grim news. Miss Marple, seated by her lace-curtained window, stirred her tea slowly while her thoughts drifted back to the bookshop. The accident, they had called it, a heavy oak shelf collapsing. Poor Hugo Drake pinned beneath. Yet in her long life, Miss Marple had learned to distrust such easy explanations. A shelf does not fall without reason, especially one that Colonel Ashworth himself had inspected. And the bruising on Drake's temple, as Dr. Haydock hinted, did not match a falling bookcase. It matched a strike delivered moments before. At 10 o'clock sharp, a knock came at her cottage door. Lady Ashworth, her cheeks pale but her spirits brisk as ever, swept in. "Jane, my dear, the inspector will be calling us to give statements this afternoon. But I simply cannot sit idle until then. The roof fund is in jeopardy. The villagers are whispering, and now everyone fears the shop is cursed." Miss Marple folded her hands, her eyes calm. "It is not curses we must fear, Dolly, but secrets. Tell me, has anything gone missing from the shop?" Lady Ashworth hesitated. "I cannot be certain. The place was locked after the accident, and Inspector Graves has sealed it. But," she lowered her voice, "one of the volunteers swears the catalogue does not match the books on display. A Tennyson volume in particular." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked. "Ah yes, the perfect Tennyson, always at the heart of the storm." That afternoon, Inspector Graves summoned the volunteers to Gossington Hall's drawing room. The heavy curtains were drawn back to let in the pale sunlight, and the long oak table had been cleared for his papers. Lady Ashworth stood stiffly at one end, while Colonel Ashworth, pipe in hand, tried to keep a stern dignity. The 4 volunteers took their seats: Clarissa the librarian, pale and fidgeting with her spectacles; Basil Trent, the historian, with his notebooks stacked like armor before him; Ada Pettigrew, clutching her reticule as if it held more secrets than coins; and Gregory Vale, leaning back with careless charm, his cufflinks flashing. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively in a corner, her knitting bag at her side. Few noticed her presence, yet her eyes missed nothing: the tapping of Vale's shoe, the way Clarissa avoided Basil's gaze, the proud tilt of Ada's chin. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "You all know why you are here. Mr. Drake's death is no longer treated as an accident. Evidence suggests foul play. I will hear each of your statements. And let me be clear, half-truths will not serve you." Silence fell. A clock ticked loudly on the mantelpiece. Vale spoke first, smoothly. "Inspector, I had left the shop before evening. I spent the night at the inn. As the innkeeper can confirm, I was shocked. I tell you, when I heard of Drake's tragic end." "Indeed," Graves said coldly. "We will confirm that, but tell me, what of the Tennyson first edition? Witnesses saw you handle it with unusual interest." Vale smiled faintly. "A bookseller's habit, I cannot resist a fine binding. Nothing more. Miss Marple noted the sheen of sweat just visible near his temple. Clarissa spoke next, voice trembling. I only went back for my glasses. Inspector, I admit I entered through the side window, but only because I was embarrassed to trouble Lady Ashworth for the key. Then I found the shelf fallen, and Mr. Drake already still. Her words faltered, her hands twisting in her lap. Miss Marple saw the tiniest ink smudge on her fingertips. Violet in color. Odd, Clarissa always used green ink in her catalog cards. Basil Trent's turn came. He adjusted his spectacles and declared firmly, "My interest has always been historical. Inspector, I was cataloging pamphlets on the 1630 uprising. The poetry section did not concern me. Whatever tricks Drake was involved in, I had no part in them." Yet his voice quivered ever so slightly when he spoke of the poetry shelves. Miss Marple's ear caught the false note like a musician spotting a discordant string. Ada Pettigrew, finally, raised her chin. "I will say only this. Drake did not value books. He valued profit. That alone should direct your suspicion. I was at home with my sister at the time of the accident." "You may ask her." Inspector Graves nodded curtly, making notes, but Miss Marple had already woven the first threads of doubt. Too many alibis. Too many coincidences. As the session ended, she rose quietly and spoke for the first time. "Inspector, forgive an old woman's intrusion, but I could not help noticing a small matter." Graves raised an eyebrow. "Yes, Miss Marple?" Her blue eyes sparkled. "The catalog card for the Tennyson. I believe the reserve price was written in violet ink. Was it not? Curious, since Miss Oswald here favors green, Miss Pettigrew black, but one gentleman among us is known for his violet ink." Basil Trent's face tightened, though he said nothing. The air in the room thickened. Lady Ashworth's hand trembled upon her lace handkerchief. Colonel Ashworth's pipe went cold between his teeth, and Inspector Graves leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Indeed, Miss Marple," he said softly, "that is curious, very curious indeed." The storm, Miss Marple thought, was only beginning. The shattered testimonies. The drawing room of Gossington Hall had never felt so oppressive. Heavy velvet curtains dulled the daylight, and the air carried the faint scent of beeswax and coal. Inspector Graves paced the length of the oak table, his notebook snapping shut in his hand. "You've all given your statements," he said, his tone clipped. "Now we'll see how well they hold when compared." A hush fell. Clarissa shifted uncomfortably, her glasses sliding down her nose. Basil Trent pretended to reread his notes, though the quiver of his jaw betrayed him. Ada Pettigrew sat like a hawk, her sharp eyes daring anyone to question her honesty. Gregory Vale leaned back, feigning ease, but his fingers tapped an uneven rhythm against his chair. Inspector Graves turned first to Clarissa. "You claimed you entered the shop to retrieve your spectacles. Miss Oswald, you say you heard nothing unusual until you found Drake beneath the fallen case. Yet," he pulled a folded slip of paper from his notebook, "a villager reports hearing two voices raised in argument around that same hour. One of them was Drake's. Can you explain that?" Clarissa's face blanched, she clutched her skirt tightly. I may have heard something," she stammered, "but it was muffled. Inspector, I couldn't distinguish the words. And I was frightened, I only wanted my glasses." Graves leaned closer, his voice low and sharp. "Or did you hear more than you admit? Perhaps something that implicates one of your fellow volunteers?" Miss Marple, from her quiet corner, noted how Clarissa's eyes flickered, first toward Basil, then quickly away. The inspector pounced on it. "Mr. Trent, perhaps you can shed light on this. You claim you were concerned only with historical pamphlets, yet witnesses place you near the poetry section earlier in the day. Why lie about it?" Basil's fingers tightened around his pen. "I did glance at the shelves. Yes, but only idly, a scholar's curiosity, nothing more." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She had heard enough scholars in her lifetime to know the difference between genuine curiosity and guilty caution. Graves did not let him breathe. "Strange, then, that the catalog entry for the Tennyson volume is written in violet ink. The same shade you habitually use. Explain that, Mr. Trent." A ripple went through the room. Basil flushed deeply. "Nonsense, anyone could have altered that entry. Perhaps even Clarissa, she handles the catalog daily." Clarissa gasped, her hands trembling. "I use green ink only. Everyone here knows it." The tension thickened like storm clouds. Graves wheeled suddenly on Gregory Vale. "And you, sir, you speak of leaving for the inn. Yet no one recalls seeing you until late evening, long after Drake's death was discovered. Convenient, isn't it? Vale's composure faltered for the first time. He licked his lips before replying. The innkeeper, he will confirm I was there. Indeed, Graves said coolly, and yet the innkeeper remembers you arriving flushed. Breathless, well past 10 o'clock, not the leisurely guest you pretend to be. Perhaps you were delayed by a quarrel in the bookshop? Vale's smile vanished. He sat forward, his voice sharp. You cannot pin this on me. I may have arrived late, but I had no quarrel with Drake. Ask anyone. I was indifferent to that pompous dealer. Indifference? Graves echoed. Odd, given you were seen slipping a small volume into your coat earlier. Care to tell us what became of it? The silence rang louder than any denial. Ada Pettigrew gave a derisive laugh. Thieves, all of you, pretending to care for literature, when all you want is profit. At least I do not hide my passion for first editions. Graves turned on her. And what of your alibi? Miss Pettigrew, you claim to have been at home with your sister. But your neighbor swears he saw you hurrying down the lane that very evening. Clutching a parcel. Where were you truly? Ada's face hardened. My sister can vouch for me. As for the neighbor, he is mistaken. Yet her hands, so steady before, twisted the handle of her reticule with a nervous energy. Miss Marple noticed how tightly she gripped it, as if guarding something more dangerous than a handkerchief. The inspector's voice cut through the thick silence. Each of you conceals something, and each of you contradicts another. Drake did not die by chance. Someone in this room knows exactly how and why, and the more you attempt to twist your stories, the clearer the lies become. A chair creaked. Clarissa whispered, almost to herself. He said someone had tampered with the Tennyson, that it was worth far more than anyone realized. He was afraid. The words hung in the air. All eyes turned to her. Basil's hand froze over his notebook. Ada's lips tightened. Vale's tapping ceased. Miss Marple folded her knitting calmly and looked up, her eyes sharp as steel behind their gentle blue. Yes, she said softly, and that fear cost him his life. The room fell utterly still. For the first time, each of the suspects seemed to sense that their careful defenses were crumbling. Piece by piece, under the relentless weight of truth, the lies exposed, the atmosphere in the drawing room had shifted. What began as a tangle of evasions was hardening into something sharper, more dangerous. The volunteers no longer looked like a gathering of neighbors. They resembled players caught on a stage where the script had slipped. Exposing the truth beneath, Inspector Graves struck the table with his palm. Enough shadows. It is time to drag this business into the light. He opened his notebook again. But Miss Marple's quiet voice forestalled him. Inspector, if I may, sometimes lies unravel best not under the weight of official interrogation, but with a simple observation. Her words were mild, but the silence that followed was heavy. Everyone in the room seemed to brace themselves. She turned first to Gregory Vale. You say you left for the inn long before the tragedy. And yet, your boots. Her eyes flicked to the mud still clinging to the soles. The innkeeper's courtyard is paved with stone, but the path behind the bookshop, where you were seen, is muddy even in dry weather. You had reason to linger there, didn't you? Vale's mouth tightened. Coincidence, he muttered. I cut across the fields. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, but cutting across the fields would not explain the page fragment found in your coat pocket, torn from a catalog card. The very same paper used in the shop. Gasps rippled. Vale's composure cracked, his hands clenching into fists. Before he could reply, she shifted her gaze to Ada Pettigrew. In you, Miss Pettigrew, your alibi is fragile. Your reticule, may I see it? Ada clutched the bag tighter. This is outrageous. Graves snapped. Open it. With trembling fingers, Ada loosened the clasp. Inside lay a small square of gilded marbled paper. Miss Marple lifted it delicately between her knitting needles. Fresh, she said softly, from the forgery, the same design as the scraps in Mr. Rudge's binder shop. You knew of the counterfeit before the others. Ada's face flushed crimson. I merely admired the craft. That does not make me a murderer. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed calmly, but it does make you a liar. The room turned next to Basil Trent, whose jaw had gone pale. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. Mr. Trent, you insist your interest was purely historical, yet the catalog ledger bears your violet ink. A convenient alteration, turning a reserve price of £30 into £300. Your passion for scholarship does not excuse forgery. Trent slammed his pen onto the table. You cannot prove I killed Drake. No, Miss Marple said softly, but you see, lies betray themselves. You wrote of 300 in your own hand. When confronted, You blamed Miss Oswald, though she never used violet ink. A scholar, Mr. Trent, should know better than to leave fingerprints on the very evidence he creates. Trent's face twisted with fury, but he had no words. Finally, Miss Marple's gaze rested on Clarissa Oswald. The librarian looked fragile, her glasses fogging with each nervous breath. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, you told us you heard nothing distinct. Yet just moments ago, you admitted Drake spoke of the Tennyson. Why the contradiction? Clarissa's lips quivered. She whispered, because if I told the truth, they would all turn on me. I did hear him. He said the forgery would ruin everything. He said someone here had betrayed the charity. Graves stepped forward. And who did he accuse? Clarissa shook her head, near tears. I couldn't tell. His voice broke. Then the crash came. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. Not knowing is not a crime, my dear, but hiding what you heard gives weight to the liar's cloak. And tonight, we have stripped away much of that fabric. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the hall clock. The suspects sat rigid, their faces pale masks, each more cracked than before. Inspector Graves finally spoke, his voice firm. One of you struck the fatal blow. Perhaps more than one of you schemed together. But know this, the lies you've spun are already collapsing. The truth is closing in. And when it does, there will be no room left to hide. Miss Marple folded her knitting and looked up, her eyes sharper than steel. Yes, she said softly, for lies always leave behind traces. And those traces will lead us straight to the killer. The room erupted with murmurs. But beneath the noise lay an undeniable certainty. The net was tightening. And the endgame was near. Chapter 7 Silent Footprints. New shadows at midnight. The hours after the confrontation felt heavier than the evening sky. Inspector Graves had dismissed the suspects for the night, but not without warning. None of them were to leave the village until the inquiry was complete. Still, suspicion hung in the air like damp fog, seeping into every corner of Lady Ashworth's old bookshop. Miss Marple did not retire. Instead, she sat quietly in Lady Ashworth's parlor, her knitting needles clicking in steady rhythm. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters and the distant church bell marked the slow march of midnight. It never ends with lies, she murmured to herself. Truth has a way of stirring again, even in the dead of night. As if in answer, a faint noise echoed across the courtyard, the creak of wood underfoot. Inspector Graves, half dozing in a chair nearby, stiffened at once. Did you hear that? Yes, Miss Marple replied calmly, setting aside her knitting. Footsteps, on the outside stairs of the shop. They crossed the courtyard quickly, the lantern in Graves's hand casting tall, wavering shadows. The bookshop loomed against the night sky, its windows dark, its sign swinging in the chill wind. The staircase leading to the upper door was slick with rain. And there, pressed into the mud at its base, were footprints, fresh and sharp. Graves knelt, holding the lantern low, small, size 5, perhaps 6, likely a woman. Miss Marple leaned closer, and notice, the impressions climb upward. But no marks return. Whoever entered has not come down again. The inspector's jaw tightened. Then she's still inside. The door at the top of the stairs was locked, at least to outward appearance. But as Graves turned the handle, it yielded with surprising ease. Someone had oiled the latch. The door swung open silently, revealing the hushed interior of the shop. Within, the lantern light danced across rows of bookshelves, their leather spines glowing faintly like watchful eyes. The silence was unnatural, no rustle of pages, no shifting of floorboards, yet a faint beam of light flickered deeper inside, somewhere near the poetry alcove where Drake had died. Graves whispered, "Stay behind me." But Miss Marple, as ever, did not obey entirely. She moved with quiet certainty, her sharp eyes scanning every corner. They followed the glow until they reached the alcove. The beam came from a torch set upon the floor, its light illuminating a toppled stack of books. Someone had been searching. On the open pages of a scattered volume, flecks of gold leaf glittered faintly, fresh, unmistakable. Binding gold again, Miss Marple murmured. And then, a sound, the faint scrape of wood against stone, coming from the far end of the shop. They turned, lantern raised. A panel in the wall shifted. For an instant, a figure was visible, slender, wrapped in a cloak, darting through a hidden door. The panel swung shut before Graves could reach it. "Damnation," he barked, slamming his fist against the wood. "There's a passage." Miss Marple touched the panel with her fingers, her expression unreadable. "Not just a passage, Inspector, a memory of the building's former life." Carriage houses often had concealed compartments. Someone knows this place far better than they admit. The inspector's face darkened, and someone has risked everything to return tonight. On the floor beside the torch lay something small, a torn piece of card. Smudged with violet ink, the number was clear, Lot 27. Graves picked it up, his eyes narrowing. The Tennyson again. Miss Marple nodded gravely. It seems our midnight visitor was not searching blindly. They came for something specific. And if I'm not mistaken, the forgery was not their only secret. Outside, the church bell struck once, its hollow tone rolling through the village. Midnight, the hour when shadows grow longest, and truths, however well hidden, begin to stir. Miss Marple gazed at the sealed panel, her voice low but certain. The killer has just revealed themselves. Inspector, we may not yet know the full shape of the truth, but the lies are tightening into a noose. The search for the hidden passage. The torn card lay heavy in Inspector Graves's palm, though it was no larger than a coin. Lot 27, the cursed Tennyson, the single thread that seemed to wind through every knot of this case. He slipped it carefully into his notebook, then turned back to the wall. We'll break it open, he muttered. If there's a passage behind this panel, I'll see where it leads. Miss Marple, however, laid a gentle hand on his sleeve. Inspector, smashing wood at midnight might frighten away more than it reveals. We need to be sure before we charge like bulls into a hedge. Graves grunted, but her calm logic held him. He held the lantern close. Examining the wall, the paneling was thick oak, polished by years of beeswax, but near the skirting board a faint groove ran vertically, too precise to be natural. There, Miss Marple said softly, a hinge cut into the wood, old, but still sound. Try pressing along the molding. The inspector obliged, his fingers probing until one section yielded with a faint click. The panel swung inward on hidden pivots, and a stale breath of air exhaled into the shop. The lantern revealed a narrow passage, its walls of bare stone. Dust coated the floor, yet new footprints marred its surface, slender, hurried, pressed deep into the grit. Graves lowered the lantern. Our visitor fled this way. The trail is fresh. Miss Marple peered in, her sharp eyes gleaming. And notice, Inspector, these prints are uneven. One step drags more heavily. The intruder may have injured themselves while scrambling in the dark. They entered the passage cautiously. The air grew colder, damp with the smell of earth and mildew. Spiderwebs trailed from the ceiling, but they had been recently broken. Strands dangling loose, the corridor twisted sharply, leading them downward, as if burrowing beneath the courtyard itself. After 20 paces, they reached a junction, two paths, one veering left toward the foundations of the carriage house, the other sloping steeply down into shadow. Graves lifted the lantern higher. Which way? Miss Marple knelt, studying the disturbed dust. Both paths have been used. But see here, the fresher marks go left. A woman's shoe, narrow sole, about size 5. She passed here less than an hour ago. Graves straightened, his voice taut. Then we follow. They pressed on, the passage narrowing until Graves had to stoop. Faint echoes accompanied their steps, like whispers trapped in stone. At last, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, perhaps once a storage cellar. Broken crates littered the ground. In the center stood a heavy oak chest, its lid half open. Inside lay scraps of paper, brittle and yellowed, along with remnants of leather bindings. Graves rummaged carefully, his brow furrowing. Fragments of books, torn apart. Someone was rifling through these in a hurry. Miss Marple picked up one scrap with delicate fingers. Gold leaf clung to the edge, shining under the lantern. From the same batch as before, she murmured, but look closer. Inspector, this isn't poetry. It's historical, a pamphlet, perhaps 17th century. Whoever searched here was after more than a Tennyson. Graves swore under his breath. Another forgery scheme? Or a hidden document? Before Miss Marple could reply, a sound echoed faintly through the passage, a door slamming somewhere beyond, followed by the hurried patter of footsteps retreating. The intruder had found another exit. They pursued quickly, lantern light bobbing across the damp walls. The footprints veered toward a narrow stairwell cut directly into the stone. Upward it climbed, spiraling tightly until they reached a trapdoor. Graves shoved it open, and they emerged into the chill night air. They were in the rear garden of the bookshop, beneath a stand of yew trees. The branches dripped with rain, and the moon hung low behind drifting clouds. Across the grass, the prints of the fleeing figure trailed toward the boundary wall, where a small gate stood ajar. Graves dashed forward but paused as Miss Marple bent down. She plucked something from the grass, a fragment of fabric. Crimson wool, torn as if caught on a splinter of wood. Her voice was calm, but her eyes sharp, so the woman in the red cloak was not a phantom after all. Graves clenched his jaw. Then she's real, and she's running scared. From beyond the gate, the faint echo of hooves drifted into the night, someone departing in haste on horseback. By the time they reached the lane, only silence remained, broken by the lonely creak of the gate. Miss Marple held the crimson scrap tightly. The lies are weaving together. Inspector, the forgery, the missing pamphlet, and now this mysterious woman. They are all threads of the same cloth, and if we follow carefully, the pattern will reveal itself. Graves exhaled sharply, frustration plain on his face. But damn it, we were so close. Miss Marple gave a faint smile, her voice low but steady. Close is enough for now. Tonight she has shown her hand, even if only in shadow. And shadows, Inspector, always leave a trail. Clues the dark forgot. The night seemed to breathe again after the echo of hooves faded into silence. Inspector Graves slammed the small gate shut, muttering curses under his breath. But Miss Marple lingered among the dripping yews, her sharp eyes scanning the ground as though the earth itself were whispering secrets. Inspector, she called softly, don't trample so, the ground speaks if we listen. Graves stilled, lantern raised. In the soft earth near the gate, the imprints of boots overlapped with smaller, lighter marks. Miss Marple crouched, her hand hovering above the soil. 2 riders, she observed, the heavier set belonged to a man. Boots broad, worn at the outer heel. But the second, yes, unmistakably a lady's shoe, the same size 5 that haunted the tunnel. The woman did not ride alone, she was escorted. Graves swore again, so she has an accomplice. Miss Marple did not answer at once. She plucked a twig from the hedge where the crimson fabric had torn. Tiny specks glimmered against the bark, flakes of gilt, faint but undeniable under lantern light. She rubbed them gently between her fingers. Gold leaf again, the same as in the cellar. It seems our mysterious lady carried something freshly gilded. Perhaps a volume, or part of one. The inspector leaned closer, frustration and curiosity mingling. If she took a book, why flee in such haste? And why leave behind so many traces? Because, Miss Marple replied, panic makes poor thieves. She may not even realize what she carried clings to her cloak like crumbs of bread to a baker's apron. They returned inside through the hidden passage, retracing their steps with care. The cellar still smelled of damp stone and broken bindings. But under sharper scrutiny the chamber yielded further revelations. On the floor beside the shattered crates, Miss Marple uncovered a small brass button. Dulled with age, she held it up for inspection. From a gentleman's waistcoat, I think. Look at the thread. It tore free during a struggle. Our intruder did not search calmly. There was conflict here. Graves took the button grimly. Then perhaps 2 intruders, quarreling, the woman in red and her escort. Or victim, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes shifted to the chest, where a corner of parchment protruded beneath the scattered scraps. She drew it out delicately. It was a catalog card, similar to the torn fragment they had discovered earlier. But complete, in violet ink, it bore the same neat hand. Lot 27 Tennyson, first edition, reserve £300. But below, faintly visible where someone had pressed too hard with the nib, was a ghostly indentation of another word, pamphlet. Graves let out a low whistle. So the forgery and the pamphlet are tied together. Drake, Trent, maybe even the woman, all circling the same prize. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful, and whoever altered the reserve knew precisely what treasure lay hidden. Not poetry, but history, a secret concealed in plain sight. Their search carried them further into the passage. Near the stairwell, Miss Marple paused abruptly. On the rough stone wall, barely visible in the lantern's glow, a smear of something dark had dried. She touched it with her gloved hand. Blood, she said simply. Fresh last night. Someone scraped themselves badly while fleeing. Graves stiffened. Then we can match the wound when we find them. A silence followed, broken only by dripping water. Miss Marple's gaze grew distant, her mind stitching together the scraps, the fabric, the footprints, the gilt, the button, the blood. Each seemed small alone, yet together they painted the outline of desperation. She whispered more to herself than to the inspector. Whoever that woman is, she carries with her the shadow of the truth. But truth, Inspector, is a heavy burden. and such burdens have a way of crushing the hands that cling to them. Graves tightened his jaw. Then we press harder. I'll have every rider in the county questioned by dawn. Someone will have noticed a red cloak on horseback. Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on the fragments of parchment. The card, the gold flakes. Yes, but not all lies gallop away in the dark. Some remain, hiding in silence, waiting for dawn. We must be ready when the light reveals what the night concealed. As they sealed the passage behind them and stepped once more into the deserted bookshop, the lantern's glow flickered across rows of patient spines. The books themselves seemed to hold their breath, guarding their secrets. Outside, the first pale suggestion of dawn touched the horizon, and with it came the sense that the web was tightening, that the forgotten clues had begun to speak. The confrontation in the night. They left the shop in darkness save for a single lantern Miss Marple insisted on placing low on the floor. Its glow cast sideways like a trap for moths. The atlas cabinet stood almost, but not quite, closed. The gap was deliberate. A whisper of invitation. Inspector Graves posted a constable at the yard gate and another by the coal chute, while he and Miss Marple took the shadowed angle beside the poetry alcove. Close enough to hear breath, far enough to see without being seen. The rain had thinned to a fine mist that freckled the panes. Somewhere beyond Gossington Road a horse stamped and snorted. The clock in the hall below began to grind toward midnight. A soft scrape came from the cellar. Then the faintest clink of metal on stone. Miss Marple touched Graves's sleeve once, now, and the inspector's hand froze on his whistle. The panel behind the atlas case breathed inward, and a figure shouldered through. A man, hunched, one arm bound with a strip of linen, his coat dark, his hair rain-slicked. He paused, listening, then he went straight to the cabinet with the instinct of someone who had done this before. Miss Marple could smell him before she saw his face properly. Coal dust, damp wool, and the faint, sweet, unmistakable varnish and glue scent of a binder's bench. He set his lantern on the floor, reached into the cavity, and swore softly when his fingers met only emptiness. The oath carried the polished vowels of a lecture hall. Mr. Crow, Miss Marple said gently into the dark. Basil Crow flinched so violently his lantern rolled and spun, throwing mad spokes of light around the room. Then the inspector was there, solid and unyielding between Crow and the coal passage. Not a step, Graves said. Hands where I can see them. Crow lifted his good hand, the other still hugged to his chest beneath the linen. Inspector, Miss Marple, this is a misunderstanding. The best misunderstandings, in my experience, Miss Marple replied, are the ones prepared with considerable care. Outside, hooves struck sparks from the cobbles. A rider flashed across the window. Just a smear of deep red in the lantern's wobble, and a woman's voice. Low and urgent, cut the night, Basil. The door latch rattled. The constable at the yard cried out as the horse shouldered past his grasp. Crow twisted toward the sound, panic surfacing and sinking in a single breath. She shouldn't be here, he whispered. She was meant to be. He bit off the rest. Meant to be where? Graves asked. Silence, only the horse's receding thunder, and then the drip-drip from the gutter. Miss Marple stepped into the lantern's rim. Even in that meager light she saw what she had expected to see. A waistcoat with one brass button missing. Its twin shape a pale circle on the cloth. A smear of dried blood at the bend of Crow's wrist. Partly hidden by the linen, a faint dusting of gilt leaf clinging to the cuff. Bright as pollen. You are hurt, she said, on the right forearm, the same height as the scrape on the tunnel wall. Crow lifted his chin. I slipped. This place is a warren. And the button? Graves pressed, holding up the small brass disc they had found in the cellar. He brought it to the waistcoat. It sat perfectly in the empty ring of thread. Crow's mouth thinned. Coincidences happen, Inspector. They do, Miss Marple agreed, but they rarely travel in packs. Violet ink in the ledger, violet ink in your correspondence. Your hand on the reserve price, 300 where 30 once stood. Fresh gold leaf on your cuff, and again on the torn cloak that fled the yard. An injured arm where blood marked the stone. And now, here you are, taking the straightest path to a secret you knew was there. Crow's composure wavered. He looked toward the door, where the red shadow had gone, as if courage might be cantered back to him on a bridle. I came to recover property, he said hoarsely, not for myself, for history. History is a jealous mistress. Graves said, she prefers her admirers to apply for warrants. Crow drew a breath, steadier now, the scholar putting on his armor. Lucian Vale is the forger. Not I, He toyed with bindings and paste at Mrs. Dalloway's back room. And he altered the Tennyson without my consent. I discovered his deceit, and I meant to put it right before your investigation smeared every name in this village." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but not with sympathy. "And the woman who called your name?" "A fraction of time, barely a heartbeat. Then, a friend," Crow said, "a frightened one. She has nothing to do with this." Miss Marple said nothing. She had already noticed, days ago, that Eliza Hart's shoes were new but scuffed at the left heel. That her gloves never left her hands, that she had flinched. Only once, when Miss Marple brushed her sleeve and a small cloud of gilt dust rose in the library's sun. She kept those observations as a seamstress keeps pins, handy and sharp. Graves drew Crow's wounded arm free with a careful but implacable hand. The linen came away damp. Under it, the skin bore a livid graze scored with grit. "You will account for this," the inspector said. "I will account for everything." Crow returned, too quickly. "In the morning, with counsel." "In the morning," Miss Marple repeated, almost kindly. "But not tonight." She bent, lifted the fallen lantern, and the little flame steadied, no longer spinning. "Tonight, Mr. Crow, the books will sleep again. And so, I think, should lies." Crow's eyes flashed. "You think me a liar, Miss Marple?" "I think," she said, "you are a man who tells the truth in fragments, and hopes the missing pieces will be mistaken for shadows." Footsteps thudded in the yard. The constable returned, breathless and empty-handed. "Lost her at the lane, sir. Blood on the gatepost, though fresh." "Then she is hurt," Miss Marple murmured, "and in need of care." "People in need of care make mistakes. We must be gentle and very, very attentive." Graves clicked the cuffs shut, one bright, clinical sound that rang down the quiet aisles. Crow did not fight. He merely looked past them to the cabinet, to the gap in its back where something priceless had not been. And his face altered with a scholar's grief, the kind that gnaws rather than breaks. "Take him," Graves said, quietly. As they moved toward the door, a draft passed through the shop, and the rows of books seemed to sigh, the old leather shrinking, the paper settling, a building exhaling the night it had held in. Miss Marple set the lantern on the counter and smoothed the corner of the catalog page with one small, precise touch. "Inspector," she said, "in the morning, may we have Mr. Crow's statements taken in full? And might I ask Miss Hart to bring the auction records she took home to finish indexing? It would be a kindness to have them reunited." Graves shot her a look that mixed irritation with reluctant admiration. "You already know where this is going, don't you?" "I know where it might go," Miss Marple replied. "The rest depends on whether people prefer salvation or pride." She smiled, faint and tired, and on whether the woman in the red cloak can bear the weight of a secret without dropping it on the road. They stepped out into the yard. The mist had thickened to a pale veil over the cobbles, and beyond the gate the lane ran silver and empty beneath a whitening sky. Somewhere, a church bell marked the hour. The constable led Basil Crow toward the waiting motorcar. The door shut with a sober clack. Miss Marple looked once over her shoulder at the darkened windows of the bookshop. "Books," she said to no one, "are so honest. When you open them, they tell you what's inside. If only people were bound so cleanly." "Tomorrow," Graves said, coming to stand beside her, "we see what he truly knows." "Yes," Miss Marple answered, "tomorrow." And with that, Chapter 7 closed, on a lantern gone cold, a red cloak stained at the hem, and a scholar's wrists bright with steel, leaving the dawn to carry their shadows toward the questioning room. Chapter 8 The Official Interrogation. A room of shadows and truths. The interrogation room at the Much Benham police station was small, square, and mercilessly bare. A single lamp hung low from the ceiling, its cone of light cutting a bright circle on the wooden table, leaving the corners of the room steeped in shadow. The air smelled faintly of ink, cold stone, and damp coats hung by the door. Inspector Graves stood with his arms crossed, watching the man seated opposite. Basil Crow sat stiffly in the chair, his face drawn and pale beneath the harsh light. His wounded arm was now bandaged properly, but he held it close to his chest as though still nursing the sting of accusation. His eyes darted once toward the door, then settled again on the table's surface, refusing to meet the inspector's gaze. Miss Marple, by contrast, sat quietly to one side, her knitting needles still in their bag, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Her presence was unobtrusive, almost grandmotherly, but the sharp glint in her eyes revealed that she missed nothing. She had insisted on attending, not as a participant but as a witness. "Graves," though reluctant at first, had long since learned the value of her quiet observations. "Let's begin," Graves said, his voice flat, deliberate. He slid a folder onto the table. Inside lay the evidence: the brass button from Crow's waistcoat, the photograph of the violet ink ledger entry, and a sample of the gold leaf dust scraped from his cuff. One by one, he laid them out before Crow, as if setting pieces of a puzzle that no denial could scatter. Crow shifted, cleared his throat, and finally spoke. "I told you last night, this is a mistake. You've dragged me here like a criminal. But all I sought was knowledge. Those documents belonged in the hands of scholars, not gathering dust in a country barn." "You mean Lady Ashworth's bookshop," Graves said dryly, "the very shop where Hugo Drake was killed." Crow's lips pressed into a thin line. "An accident." Graves leaned forward sharply. "Don't insult me. Don't insult the intelligence of this woman." He gestured toward Miss Marple, "who saw more in one evening than you've admitted in a week." For the first time, Crow's eyes flicked toward Miss Marple. She returned the look gently, with no malice, only a kind of patient disappointment, as though she were gazing at a child caught with ink-stained fingers. "You see, Mr. Crow," she said softly, "accidents rarely leave so many deliberate marks. Ink altered to inflate prices, buttons torn on the coal passage, fresh wounds that match the tunnel scrape, lies told in fragments, hoping shadows would cover the rest." Crow's jaw tightened, his fingers curled against the tabletop. "You call them lies, I call them omissions." "Omissions," Graves repeated, his tone sharp, "convenient gaps where the truth should be." He tapped the folder. "Every omission you've made points to intent, and intent points to guilt." The silence stretched. The ticking of the station clock bled into the room. Crow swallowed hard, his throat moving visibly. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost pleading. "Do you think I wanted blood on my hands? Do you think I set out to kill Drake? No. He was a man of greed, of threats. I was protecting something far greater than him, or myself." Graves's eyes narrowed. "Protecting what?" Crow's gaze flicked to the evidence on the table, then upward, to the shadows gathering on the walls. He let out a long breath, the kind of sigh that carries both defeat and relief. "The Cromwell letter," he said. The words dropped into the room like stones into a well. Even Graves, who prided himself on composure, felt a shift in the air. Miss Marple simply inclined her head, as if she had been waiting patiently for those very syllables. "Now," Graves said, his voice low but firm, "we are getting somewhere. The full confession." Inspector Graves did not move. His hand hovered near the folder, but his eyes were locked on Basil Crow as though any sudden gesture might break the fragile thread of truth that had just begun to unravel. "The Cromwell letter," Graves repeated, each word clipped and heavy. "You'd better explain that, Crow." Crow shifted uneasily, his bandaged arm twitching as if the memory of his struggle still burned in his muscles. He raised his eyes at last, no longer defiant but hollow, like a man cornered by his own conscience. "It began innocently enough," he said, voice hoarse. "I had heard rumors, scraps in old catalogs, footnotes in forgotten journals, that Oliver Cromwell himself once wrote a letter about the uprising at Gospel Oak in 1630. Historians dismissed it as a myth, but I was convinced it existed, and when Mrs. Weatherby donated her late husband's library to Lady Ashworth's charity, I knew the collection might contain the very proof I had chased for years." Miss Marple's soft murmur filled the silence. "So you volunteered to help with the cataloging?" Crow nodded, shame flickering across his face. "Yes. At first I only sought the pamphlets, trivial things to most eyes. But to me, they were a map, and then I found it, hidden inside the boards of the Tennyson volume. Beneath the binding, there it was, a pamphlet describing the uprising in detail, with a note that Cromwell's own letter was enclosed once, long ago, but the letter itself, it was gone." Inspector Graves slammed a palm lightly on the table. "And Drake?" Crow's lips twisted bitterly. He was sharper than I expected. He noticed the binding had been tampered with, and he pressed me until I confessed. I begged him to keep silent, promised him recognition if the documents proved genuine. But he smelled opportunity. He said he could help me by forging a perfect reproduction of the Tennyson. That way, no one would know the original had been disturbed. He wanted money, and the right to sell the forgery. His voice cracked with disgust at the memory. "Did you pay him?" Graves asked. Crow swallowed hard. £300. All I had to spare. He promised to restore the original binding and deliver the forged copy to sell at the auction. But the greed in him grew. He discovered mention of the Cromwell letter. And suddenly the forgery was not enough. He wanted the letter itself. He threatened to expose me, to ruin me, unless I let him sell it to foreign collectors. Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp as pins. You refused. Crow's hand slammed the table. Of course I refused. That letter belonged to England, to history. I could not allow it to vanish into some private hoard. I told him he could have his money and nothing more. But he laughed. He said I was a fool, that he already had the letter hidden somewhere safe, and that without him I would never find it. Inspector Graves leaned closer, and that's when you struck him. The room seemed to shrink. Crow's breath grew ragged, his eyes gleaming with feverish memory. Yes, he whispered. We argued. He waved the reproduction in my face like a weapon. Mocking me, I lost control. I seized the book, the forged Tennyson, heavy as a brick, and I struck him. Just once. He staggered, hit his head, and fell. For a moment I thought, hoped, he was only stunned. But when I saw the blood, I knew. Silence swallowed the confession. The ticking clock was the only sound, marking each second like the drop of water in a cavern. Crow covered his face with his uninjured hand. His voice came muffled, breaking. I panicked. I dragged the ladder, tipped the bookcase, scattered paste and gold dust. I wanted it to look like an accident. I thought if the inquest found nothing suspicious, the letter might still be mine one day. But the truth was already written in every careless trace I left behind. Miss Marple's voice, gentle yet merciless, cut through his trembling. The button in the coal passage, the violet ink in the ledger, the gold dust on your cuff. They were your fingerprints. Basil, you tried to bury the truth under shadows. But shadows have a way of keeping secrets poorly. Crow's shoulders sagged. For the first time, he looked old, not in years, but in defeat. His confession hung in the stale air like smoke after a fire. Impossible to dispel. Inspector Graves closed the folder with deliberate finality. That's enough. You've admitted to the killing of Hugo Drake, to forgery, to deception. The court will decide the rest. Crow did not resist. His voice was barely a whisper. The court may have its judgment, but the letter is still out there. And without it, all of this, all the blood, was for nothing. He bowed his head. The lamp's cone of light carved deep shadows over his face, as if history itself had written its verdict in lines of exhaustion and regret. Miss Marple alone sat upright, her eyes thoughtful, for while the confession had ended the man's struggle, she knew the mystery of the Cromwell letter was not yet finished. The lies exposed and the final collapse. The room felt airless, as though every wall leaned inward, pressing the truth out of Basil Crow. Inspector Graves had risen from his chair, pacing like a man ready to close a trap. Miss Marple sat serenely, her knitting bag by her side, but her eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. You've told us part of the story, Graves said sharply, halting in front of Crow. But your lies still tangle the truth. You tried to cast suspicion on Miss Oswald, on Lady Ashworth's staff, even on phantoms in the night. But the evidence cuts through your stories like a blade. Crow raised his head, defiance flickering again. I admitted what I did. I struck Drake, yes, but I was desperate. That does not make me a cold-blooded murderer. He provoked me. Miss Marple's voice was soft, yet carried an edge that silenced the room. Provocation does not explain the ink. Basil, violet ink, used only by you, altering the ledger from £30 to 300. That was not a crime of passion, it was premeditation. Crow's mouth opened, but no words came. His hand trembled on the tabletop. Graves pressed forward, his voice low and relentless. And the gavel of fate was the glove. Basil, found in the shadows of the shop, stiff with wax and paste. Your glove, your hand, the candle dripped on it when you leaned over Drake's bleeding body. You can't blame that on panic. That is proof of presence, proof of intent. Crow's chair screeched as he pushed back. His face flushed red. No, you twist everything. I only wanted the documents. For history, for England, it was never meant to end like this. Miss Marple rose at last, her frail frame drawing all eyes. She spoke slowly, with the finality of a verdict. The Cromwell letter was never yours to claim. You sought to cloak greed beneath the garb of scholarship. But truth, Basil, is like a thread in embroidery. It may be hidden beneath the pattern. Yet a patient eye will always find where it begins. And where it ends. You left too many broken threads. The words pierced deeper than any accusation. Crow's breath faltered, his gaze darted between them, searching for escape where none remained. I thought, if I could find the letter, If I could bring Cromwell's voice back to history, then all would be forgiven. He whispered, I would be remembered, not as a thief, but as a discoverer. But Drake, he laughed at me. He said I was nothing. That without him I was a fraud. And in that moment, his voice cracked into silence. Inspector Graves stepped forward, his hand firm on Crow's shoulder. In that moment, you became a killer. Crow sagged beneath the weight of the word. Whatever fragile defenses he had clung to collapsed. He buried his face in his hands. And a hoarse sob escaped. The lies, the pretenses, the long, desperate story he had spun, shredded now, leaving only a broken man and the echoes of truth. Miss Marple lowered herself back into her chair, her expression tinged with sorrow. It is always the same, she murmured, almost to herself. A single false step, hidden at first, unravels until the whole tapestry falls apart. Graves gave the order, his voice steady, final. Take him down. The constable moved in, and Basil Crow rose without resistance. He no longer fought, no longer argued. His footsteps echoed hollowly as he was led away, each one sealing the fate he had tried so hard to deny. When the door closed, silence reclaimed the room. Only the faint hiss of the oil lamp remained. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. It is finished, she said softly, but her eyes, sharp and glimmering, betrayed the thought that lingered still, somewhere, hidden beyond reach. The Cromwell letter waited, its secret untouched, holding within it one last unanswered question. Chapter 9 Epilogue. The Cromwell Letter Secret. The bookshop lay quiet again, as though tragedy had never passed through its doors. Dust motes swirled in golden morning light, drifting lazily over the shelves. Yet beneath that calm, secrets still pulsed, waiting to be uncovered. Lady Ashworth sat stiffly in her drawing room, her teacup untouched. Colonel Ashworth hovered near the fireplace, his eyes betraying both relief and shame at the scandal that had tainted his wife's charitable dream. Inspector Graves, weary but resolute, spoke as though delivering the final lines of a case report. Basil Crow has confessed in full. He will stand trial for the murder of Hugo Drake. The forged Tennyson, the altered ledger, the glove, they're more than enough to seal his fate. Then it is finished, Lady Ashworth said with a heavy sigh. The bookshop can reopen, the roof fund will continue. But Miss Marple, seated quietly in her familiar armchair, did not nod. Her knitting needles rested idle in her lap, her sharp blue eyes gazing somewhere far beyond the walls of Gossington Hall. No, my dear, she said gently, not quite finished. The others turned toward her. Do you recall, Miss Marple continued, the torn catalogue card recovered from the shop floor? Drake's hand, written in violet ink, it recorded not only the inflated reserve price, but something else. She reached into her reticule and produced the fragment once more. Look here, faint letters, but legible. Atlas cabinet, second shelf. False front. Inspector Graves leaned closer, his brow furrowed. We searched that cabinet thoroughly. We found the pamphlet but nothing more. Miss Marple's lips curved into a knowing smile. Because you found the first hiding place. Drake, sly to the last, created another, concealed behind the second shelf. Reached only if one pressed the carved rosette at the corner. A trick not unlike those I've seen in old needlework chests. Without delay, they returned to the silent shop. The Atlas cabinet loomed in its corner, ordinary to the untrained eye. At Miss Marple's direction, Inspector Graves pressed the rosette. With a muffled click, the shelf shifted forward, revealing a narrow compartment no broader than a folded letter. Lady Ashworth gasped as Graves withdrew a sealed parchment. Its wax cracked with age. The handwriting across its surface was bold, firm, unmistakably 17th century. Oliver Cromwell. The silence that followed was almost reverent. Graves, though no historian, recognized the gravity of the document. If authentic, he whispered, this is priceless. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Drake knew, he could never sell such a treasure openly. Not without risking exposure. He hid it, perhaps intending to bargain with it when the moment was right. But ambition destroyed him before he could decide. Lady Ashworth clutched her husband's arm, her voice trembling. And now, what shall become of it? The letter belongs not to collectors, nor to opportunists, Miss Marple said firmly. It belongs to history, to the nation. Inspector Graves nodded solemnly. It will be secured in the British Museum. Scholars will study it for generations. And the Ashworth bookshop will be remembered not only for a crime, but also for a discovery of immense importance. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of centuries pressing down on them from that single folded page. At last, Miss Marple turned toward the window. The sunlight had grown stronger, spilling across the worn wood of the floor. "It is curious," she murmured, "how truth hides in shadows, yet waits patiently for the right hand to draw it into the light." She gathered her knitting bag, her work unfinished but her purpose clear. "One case closes, but I fear, Inspector, that in this village, and in this world, secrets are never far away." And with that, Miss Marple stepped out into the day, her figure small yet steady, leaving behind the bookshop and its echoes. The Cromwell letter lay safe at last, but in the hush of the morning, it whispered still, of ambition, betrayal, and the peril of hidden truths.